Thank you very much for joining the Hong Kong Biennale of Urbanism Architecture Curatorial Conversation number 10. So this particular one is entitled Density times Mobility, London, Milan, Hong Kong, Shenzhen. Now, it sounds a bit like a bit of a advertising campaign about all these shops that we have globally, but trust me, it isn't. There is a connection, and it actually also shows that the reach of the Biennale online events through our friends and our speakers and panelists. So there are people from all over the world dialing in, so welcome to you all. And there'll be a bit more about the theme later, and the link will become a little bit more apparent. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizer, Hong Kong Institute of Architects Biennale Foundation. They are the main organizer for the Biennale itself, and the co-organizers, Hong Kong Institute of Planner, as well as Hong Kong Design Association. Now, obviously, our title, just to remind everybody, is 2x2, Imagine to Innovate. And our title sponsor is DBS Bank. And for this particular event, we are in this lovely venue, thanks to our venue sponsor, Paul Parr Music, and our co-organizer, RIBA Hong Kong chapter. So, just going back to our themes, 2x2, Imagine to Innovate, and the sub-themes for under that is 3 elements to it: identity, livability, and sustainability. Now, for this particular session, it's very much focused somewhere in between livability and sustainability. We have 2 very expert speakers, international speakers. It's very hard for me to describe them in one word. I couldn't find a collective term for it. Maybe the speakers can correct me later. But they're experts in architecture, urban design, planning, mobility, and accessibility, and the use of technology in all that kind of field, in their kind of analysis, prediction, and design of our urban spaces. Now, I've heard the terms FinTech, prop tag even, but is there a something tag that describe that? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe at the end of the session we could invent one. But anyway, for this talk, it will be very much about the interrelationship between mobility and density, and also through the experience of the international speakers in their respective countries. Tim Stonor from London and Federico from Milan. So also draw into elements of Hong Kong and Shenzhen. In particular, both Tim and Federico have their exhibits in the Hong Kong and Shenzhen Biennale respectively. So that's where, in a very kind of superficial way, the 4 cities are linked together, but there are more as we go through. But now I would like to introduce my studio guest, guest panelist, Megan Lam. In really true 2x2 spirit, i.e. our Biennale theme, that we'd like a very, very diverse views and perspectives from different professions about our city. I've always said that the Biennale is for our future city builders. And by that, I don't just mean I don't mean builders such as architects or city planners, but also lawyers, accountants, doctors, healthcare workers, and so on. So these people should come together, use their imagination to create our future city. So we see this as a platform for all these people coming together to discuss various aspects of our urban environment, our city, and so on and so forth. So Megan and I met through TEDx Wan Chai, a TEDx event, which we spoke at different years, but TEDx does a very good thing of connecting people from different fields and different kind of platforms, and also speakers from different years. So we met, I did a talk in 2016, I think you did a talk in 2018, somewhere along there. And Megan is the CEO of Neuron, a digital healthcare platform or company, and her background in particular is on neuroscience and psychiatric research. And the important thing is that the use of technology is something that's also very close to what you do. So I wouldn't put mouth in Megan's words in Megan's mouth, and you will certainly tell me a little bit more about that later. So what is the connection? As I said, well, urban and suburban living, mobility, density, actually within all that, I think one of the things that we mustn't forget is the health of the population. By that, I don't just mean physical health, but mental health. And one of the issues that through the COVID-19 has the health of an urban environment has also come to the forefront of our discussion. So this is where the connection comes in. I think we don't just mean physical health, as in like COVID-19, but also mental health. How does it affect the way we, the people who live in cities like that? So that's where we come in. So Megan, just a few kind of lead-in questions.
Yes.
Do you enjoy living in Hong Kong in such a high-density city?
I would say I personally don't mind it because I'm a little biased because I was born and raised here, so I'm quite used to it. This is home for me. So there is a sentimental value attached to Hong Kong. But I have lived in the UK, Australia, the States, and there are certain quality of life factors that I really miss from there as well. So, for example, in Australia, I lived in St. Lucia in Brisbane.
Okay.
Open space, a lot of greenery. I know all my neighbors that live around me, but that's probably less common in Hong Kong. So those are the kind of things that I really miss. Or in London, walking through beautiful architecture and lots of greenery that's not perfectly manicured parks, but really peppered along the city. So those are the sort of things I really miss.
And obviously, you mentioned a couple of other cities and so on, and there are kind of benefits as well as challenges that we have to face. And from your perspective, if what are the key kind of aspects that we need to look at in terms of the effect of density, urban, suburban, in terms of living in that? What are the things in terms of psychological well-being? What are the things that we need to look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose there are like pros and cons to that, and I guess an anecdotal piece, is that the benefit of Hong Kong is close social networks. I mean, it only takes 30 minutes from where I'm sitting right now on a good day, probably not now because it's rush hour, between here to Tai Po where my family lives. And sort of that level, and public transport is so incredibly convenient in Hong Kong. We'll know that as one of sort of the distinct factors, living here. That, having that level of social connection and having access to that is really, really important, because we know that living in sort of, urban areas with high density can be extremely stressful. Yes. And having that level of social buffer, for example, can really help us with the stress factor. That being said, there are some challenges. So things like not a lot of, I'm very fortunate that my family lives here, but there's not a lot of public spaces that sort of encourage sort of community. And we know that maybe in areas where there's higher density of things like public housing, for example, like Sam Shui Po or Kowloon City, there are higher levels of suicide. And there aren't that many public areas where people can sort of congregate together and socially interact naturally. So that's one thing. And there's also sort of a gap between our natural and built environment. So one example is my apartment. So if I look through my window and squint really hard, I can see the harbor just.
Right.
But now there's a big crane right in front of there. And I know that within a year or two's time, I'll get a 360 view of what my neighbors are cooking and no longer of
the harbor.
or nature.
Well, some people might find that more interesting than the harbor, but it depends.
Yes.
No, but interesting you say that, because obviously we all know in Hong Kong public transport is very efficient. Yeah. It in a way, I often find that somehow it actually makes people more stressful. Because although it's more convenient, but actually their expectation of things happening very quickly, if it's delayed even 2 seconds, they kind of all get very tense.
Yeah.
It's like the syndrome of people pressing the closed door button about 50 times in 1 second, because it's that kind of expectation and how we deliver the city to meet certain expectation. There is a kind of interesting kind of dynamics going on there. So that's very interesting, and I think what I'd like to hear perhaps now or later on is how innovation and technology can be used to improve or what I always call the software, as in programs. Software not just as program, but the softer side of the aspects of urban living could inform the hardware, which is the infrastructure, the buildings, and so on. And healthcare, delivery of healthcare, is an important one.
Yeah.
And I think, and also that's something that you're interested in terms of how technology can help the delivery of healthcare. And before I introduce my international speakers, any thing that you want to talk about that on specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think tech and its innovative usages, for example, is very helpful in a sense that it helps paint the software aspect of it, paints a better picture of our health and wellness as we sort of live life on a day-to-day. So I always believe that sort of health really doesn't happen in a lab, and a big chunk of it actually happens outside. So it's not just medicine in a clinical sense, but about lifestyle medicine as well. How do you live your life? Is your city walkable and give you, the ability to cycle to work, for example? So things like that really matter. I'll talk about technology from an individual level and then a more higher level. So on an individual level, we now have real-time, real-world data. So that thing in your hand right now, your smartphone, is your connected devices, your wearables, is collecting a stream of continuous data types and all sorts of different data types, from your accelerometer, so understanding how your step count, to your GPS data, so understanding how Roger moves around Hong Kong. And the really cool thing about that is that we now don't just have a snapshot view of Roger doing a questionnaire right here, right now, but we now have a more seamless way of understanding Roger, going from this building to that building and going home, and having him painting a fuller picture of what your lifestyle and sort of looks like, and being able to map your health and wellness scores to that as well. So it really paints a more holistic picture of your health and wellness. An example is at Neuron, we developed an app called Clara, which also collects those data types, but we also collect mental health data. So we're actually able to understand people's, we don't call it this on our platform because it scares people sometimes, but depression, anxiety, and stress, and how that sort of relates with their day-to-day behaviors. So things like their movement throughout a city, for example, or how does that relate to the weather today or air pollution for the day. So at an individual level, we can get more granular and more seamless with that. At a higher level, this is not my area of expertise, but I think on NASA's website, on the Earth Observatory website, I read the study about, and I think it was in Denmark, using satellite data to better understand green spaces and urban density, and how that relates to people's mental health and wellness. So I think we can intuitively know that more green spaces.
So there will be the day when your phone will collect the data, whether how stressed you are in this room or how stressed you are, and therefore that data will help us to deliver the hardware in a much more kind of connected way. So that's the holy grail, I guess. And how far are we from that holy grail? Are we doing well or doing not very well? In your opinion, in one word.
I think we're doing well. I think we've progressed so much from where we've been before. So historically, the best way you can understand someone's health and wellness might be a questionnaire or going to see your doctor. Maybe a blood test or doing a mental health screening questionnaire. And once you do that one questionnaire and you don't do it again, it's just a snapshot view, like one data point. Right. But now we can have a more continuous understanding, a more contextual understanding of your mental health and wellness.
I see. Talking about data, well, I'm not being rude in reading my messages while I'm talking, but also I'm monitoring who else has joined us, and I can see that there's a great number of people joining us from all over the world. Somebody from Saudi Arabia.
Oh wow!
Right, well, welcome Saudi Arabia, and also please send us questions. It will pop up on my phone, and I'll make sure that they get read out and comments and so on. So yeah, I am not talking to somebody else at the same time. So anyway, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce my first speaker, international speaker, Tim Stonor. Tim Stonor is actually no stranger to the Biennale because obviously he is one of our curatorial advisor, and he has also presented on this platform both physically back in January in the Mills, as well as online. I think it was December. Oh no, actually it was earlier. He was supposed to be here, but because of the social movement, he was stuck in Tim was stuck in Singapore, so he delivered a session online as well. So he's absolutely no stranger to this platform and way of presenting. And also his exhibit was also part of the Hong Kong Biennale. And Tim and I first met. I don't know where you remember Tim. We worked together in a project. Funny enough, in Milan. A project in a neighborhood called San Babla. Now, I'm not sure if Marco is listening. I'm sure Marco is immediately going to correct my pronunciation of Italian. And Federico is too polite to do that. And it was a very fruitful collaboration, and I think I enjoyed it very much. And Tim formed a company called Space Syntax, which again uses technology and data and analyze and predict people's movement and traffic movement in cities and help us understand how public spaces work better and in the future, and as well as looking at it historically and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't do what you do more injustice, so I will pass it on to you, Tim, and the screen and mic is yours, Tim.
Good evening to everyone that's joining. And that was fascinating. That discussion there already gives me ideas about how the kind of technology that we use at Space Syntax, that I'm going to show some more of, could be better embedded into the technologies which are telling us about how healthy, how we feel, and what Megan's doing there, I think, is so important for architects and urbanists to come together and understand. I see that there's a great opportunity going forward. Roger, on your collective term, I was thinking about it, and my own version of this is to describe it as digital urbanism. So it brings together the technology and the fact that, yes, it's a bit of architecture, it's a bit of transport planning, there's a bit of engineering, there's a bit of social theory in there. So digital urban. If you want to call me anything, call me a digital urbanist.
Digital urbanism. Good.
How's that? So I've got a presentation here which I shall try to bring onto the screen now, everyone, and hopefully that's coming through. Which I've titled "Improve, Intensify, Extend," because in this discussion around density and mobility, I think it is the discussion which dominates almost every project that I'm involved in practice as an architect and as an urban planner. And the advice we often give our clients is, don't assume you have to grow. Don't assume that your city needs to grow. What it might actually be better doing is improving first and intensifying next. And that's something that I'll tell more about in the story as the presentation goes. But I was reminded, yes, I did join online from Singapore early last year, and didn't it seem strange then that you had someone talking to you across the airwaves, when now it's normal, and we've entered a very, very different place. But I was in Hong Kong in January for the Livability Symposium, and I just wanted to remind myself and remind anyone who might have seen that presentation of where I left off this discussion, which was around livability. And I offered 4 ingredients of livability, which I said, we have to have walkability. We have to fundamentally be able to walk around the city. We need sitability, which is the ability to stop and sit down and either rest or have a conversation with someone. Breathability is about the air and the quality of the air that we breathe. We need to have healthy cities, not the kind of pollution that the cars and vehicles have given. And lastly, transactability. And on that point, to say, well, fundamentally, why do we have cities? It's so that we can transact. And those transactions are either social or they're economic. but we have cities for the reason of transaction. It's so that people every day can come together formally and informally, usually informally, often at the end of the day, to do what these people are doing here in London, which is to be together, to communicate, to interact, and then to transact, because the deal is done. It's either a social deal, it's a friendship, or it's an economic deal. It's about someone perhaps creating a startup company, perhaps making a deal about employment or a new project. And what those comings together do often is lead to new ideas, to innovation. And the city is a transaction machine that leads to the creation of new ideas. And that helps us as a species stay alive, stay fresh, stay new, respond, be ready for the changing world around us. That's why cities are so important, but only if they're connected properly. And the other point I made back in January was to say the fragmented low density city, which is divided by highways, creates car dependence, creates loneliness, is the kind of city we've been building for nearly 100 years now. Whereas the historic city, which is integrated and dense, it's connected by slow boulevards, streets, is a city of walking and cycling and conviviality. It's a city that's innately healthy. So we need to stop building the city on the left and start building the city on the right. And this is these separations, these barriers are not only the barriers of highways, they can also be the very subtle metal barriers of pavements. And where but Hong Kong can we see so many of these barriers that break up the small, granular interactions and transactions that otherwise could be taking place, that take place in cities that don't have them. So almost all of my presentations and discussions, as you know, Roger, around the symposium, around the Biennale, have somehow involved barriers. And our first conversation, I suggested we take all the barriers down and we make something with them, a work of art or a new bridge. But we don't need them, and the good cities don't have them. The other piece to my discussion today around mobility and density is around technology. And we have to think about technology not just in terms of digital, but sometimes simple technologies. The technology of the tape measure on the left is right now being used to make sure we've got enough width on our footways for the physical distancing that cities need in order to for people to move comfortably with the coronavirus to avoid transmission. But then there are more complex technologies like the one on the right, spatial modeling, which my company Space Syntax has been a pioneer in over the last 30 to 40 years, developing an understanding that the way that streets connect, the way that some streets are longer, straighter and more connected and better used versus streets that are less well connected and less well used, is a fundamental scientific discovery to which we can then write algorithms and build models which can replace the very complex, expensive and opaque transport models that have led to the creation of the fragmented city. So these new mobility models are being used to understand walking and cycling as well as driving, and both at the small scale and at the large. So Space Syntax's exhibit in the Biennale is a model of Hong Kong, which is a model of its connectivity, street connectivity pattern, the hot red, better connected streets and the cold blue, less well connected streets. And it animates as it moves up and down the scale from pedestrian connectivity up to vehicle connectivity. I wanted to just mention something more on the coronavirus, because in terms of recent work, since I saw everyone in January, of course, the coronavirus has hit the world and is still hitting it. We at Space Syntax paused to say, how could we help think about this? How could we use spatial technology to help understand the spread of the disease, to offer something back? Because it seems very much like an urban disease, which seems to be very prevalent in denser cities. And we were taken back to the work of John Snow in the 19th century in London, looking at the outbreak of cholera around Soho, and he identified a water pump that was the source of the cholera epidemic. And this has always fascinated me because it's the combination of a real urgent emergency with a scientific approach based on mapping. And those are the things that make me excited. How can we apply technology to key uses? So we did our own form of mapping recently, and we've created a new map of London, because the issue that we thought we could help most with, or first with anyway, was around quarantine and the fact that local parts of cities might need to be locked down and the rest of the city might then be able to remain open. How could you lock down an area that was small enough so that the whole city is not adversely affected, but large enough so that those people who are locked down have access to places to shop, places to be together, as well as green spaces and open spaces? And we did this very early on in March when we really didn't know how the disease was transmitted, but it led us to a definition not based around political boundaries, not based around postcodes, but because people don't know when they cross a political boundary between one local government and the next. They don't know when they cross from one postal zone to another. Those are artificial constructs. We said, how do you define a city based around natural features? So in London, it was around the canal system, it was around the railway system, those natural barriers between areas. And then we refined an algorithm to create these neighborhood areas. And we offered this as a way of thinking through what would happen if there was an outbreak in red here. In fact, we took the same location as in the 19th century around Soho. And we then used the government's scale for lockdown, highest lockdown in red in level 5. And we thought, well, maybe there could be a concentric distancing away from the lockdown where the conditions that people have to adhere to might vary. What happens if there's a second outbreak? What happens if there's an outbreak across a city where you might have to lock down that city, but not necessarily parts of the country around it? So we're using large-scale national spatial modeling. And indeed, we have a city in the UK, Leicester, which has recently had to be locked down in its entirety. So we're now seeing this sort of analysis come to the fore. At a completely different scale, though, we've also seen the fact that during the coronavirus, people have stopped driving because they're not commuting to work, and cities and towns have had far much more walking and cycling happening in them. And that's been a real revelation. If you like, it's the silver lining to the terrible problem of the coronavirus. So in the town I'm here now in Faversham in Kent, 50 miles outside of London, we've been able, using emergency legislation, to introduce a 20 miles an hour speed limit, a 30 kilometer an hour speed limit across the town. And that is something that was being planned anyway, but is now happening much faster than it would have done across the entire town. And to make it happen, we actually used some of that John Snow thinking back from the 19th century, and we asked people to place a dot on the map where they felt unsafe. So what was their feeling? What was their mental feeling about crossing the road? Where did they feel most at risk where they crossed the road? We thought we would identify one or two junctions. In fact, we identified across the entire town, people feel afraid. So this map here isn't digital, it's actually paper. And those red dots are little red stickers. And the sheet of paper is about the size of an A1 large sheet of paper. And it became a piece of scientific evidence, if you like, social science, that demonstrated to political leaders that the community wanted this to happen. And I'm pleased to say that we've recently found out that it has been approved and it'll be going in the next month or two. So this, if you like, is an upside, along with other little measures, like at the moment, there's no pedestrian crossing here on this street. So we've been campaigning to have one. And now, as a result of COVID, this little improvement is happening to give people a place to cross the road. And this really is a message about the architecture of the city. The architecture of the city need not be the star-architecture of the city. It need not be about trophy buildings and trophy public spaces. The real architecture of the city, for me, are these small interventions that collectively produce a huge good. And that, whether it's improving, intensifying, or extending, is the approach which I just want to spend a few minutes more to talk further about. Let's start with improve, then we'll go on to intensify, then let's go on to extend. And I just want to offer some case studies from London, but also from some other cities of where we've been able to propose improvements, starting in London. This is a long time ago now. This is 24 years ago since Trafalgar Square in London looked like this, a blank wall separating the National Gallery of Art in the background from Trafalgar Square, the center of London, literally the center of Britain, where distance is measured. And yet it was an empty place because of this barrier. And the proposal was to put a new staircase into that square to let people flow through the square in new ways. And this was the CGI that was made by Norman Foster's firm, Foster and Partners, at the time. And I'm pleased to say it was built and it worked. And I say and it worked because another important lesson I think that architects need to understand is not everything that happens the way they want it to happen happens the way they want it to happen. So much of our architecture fails. So much of our public space design has failed to deliver the artist's impression of the planning proposals. And our risk mitigation, risk avoidance technique is to use technology. So in intensifying and improving the use of Trafalgar Square, we used a very primitive pedestrian movement model back in 1996, but very effective to show before the hot lines of movement went around the square because that was the easy route square. But by opening the staircase, you can see those hot red lines can now pass through the middle. And that was the useful justification for the proposals. We've learned more and moved on since then. And if I move to the Middle East, to the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, we've been helping that city for many years now, starting with improving, then intensifying, then growing. Improving, we said, well, one of the biggest problems of the city is the unplanned, informal settlements that have taken place without formal planning. They're sometimes referred to as slums, but in fact, many of them have higher quality standards than that word suggests. Now, modeling the connectivity of these places shows that they are highly, highly walkable locally. They're very walkable. And in that sense, the quality of life in some of these places, not the richest people in the city, but it's a high quality of life, was something that we wanted to celebrate and not lose when these places were improved. Because often improvement is thought of as clearing out the way and starting again. We said, no, understand how these places might be separated from the highway system of the city. The highways just fly by the side of them. So what you need to do is to connect those two movement scales so that people in their cars can pull over and stop. People walking can then trade out to the people who've pulled over in their cars and stopped. And that means designing the outside of the unplanned settlement and then allowing pathways through. So the design was based on a mobility analysis and based on a strong conviction that we weren't going to demolish these places. We were actually going to improve them and connect them outwards into the city. And different versions of that, depending upon how much money we have to invest in these places, not we, but the city and the occupants of these places, guided also by the thought that improvement might just mean planting trees and creating shade and lowering the temperature and encouraging people to walk. And in any hot climate, planting trees to reduce air temperature is such a sensible thing to do. And given the climate emergency, it's the necessary thing to do. So it's always this idea about the outcome that we want to achieve as a vision, as a visual manifestation, a sketch of an outcome, but backed up by the science and the technology of integrated urban models. So if you like, this is the core product which helps us understand which parts of the city are going to be more intensely used, which are going to be less intensely used. How can we balance movement across them? If you make everyone live in one part of the city and make everyone work in another part of the city, you're going to get a lot of movement. Why do we do that? Well, because 100 years ago, planners decided that was the safest thing to do, to zone the city with the industrial, dirty, smelly, polluting part at one end and the cleaner place upwind where people should live. Industry is different now. It's no longer dirty, smelly, and polluting in the main in cities. So we don't need to separate them anymore. We don't need to create all of the congestion that has then been created. We can think differently about how we locate things, and locating things really matters. And in this case, I put this slide in because it's about the location of doctors' surgeries. Something that I think architects, urbanists might not think about immediately, but actually whether people can access not just one doctor, but do they have a choice of accessing on foot a good doctor and several good doctors. The data on the quality of the GP practice, the general practitioner practice, and the distance from where people live is something that we've put into a model in order to reveal just the problem that this particular part of London had, that most of its population lived distant from a good doctor. So rather than necessarily changing anything physical, we might just actually want to relocate or train or improve those doctors. So further improvements just might be about extending and filling in a little gap in a low density housing estate. I've moved now to Astana in Kazakhstan, where we've been working on a master plan for the whole city, but it's been about starting with improvements, then we're going to come to intensify it, and eventually we'll extend it. So those improvements might just be about filling in a gap on the street. It might just be about broadening the base of a building to put a shop there, where at the moment there's a blank wall, to activate the street and make it feel more humane. It might, as you've seen here, be about planting trees. It might be about larger projects. The riverbanks in Astana are blank places where the water gushes through when it floods. By planting them, you can slow the water down, control the flooding, but also create terraces outside of the flood season where people can sit and enjoy. So one investment can have multiple purposes. And working with the city, we've been identifying where those improvements will have greatest effect. Let me jump back to Hong Kong briefly, because improvements in Hong Kong might be small scale. Why do we have so many of these bridges when actually the life of the city is down at street level? A lot of people say Hong Kong needs multiple levels because there's so many people living there. I disagree with much of with that statement across much of Hong Kong. Certainly in central and in the very dense areas, you do need multiple levels. But sometimes these bridges have just been built because the traffic engineer said that was the right thing to do. And the evidence that I've got to support what I'm saying is look at the ground level, it's mostly empty. So there's plenty of space at ground level to bring the city down to that slower, more generous place for pedestrians that we've seen work. And of course, as barriers have been removed through recent events in Hong Kong, we've seen different styles of movement, a far more, when I was in Hong Kong in January, a far more comfortable way of walking across the street, not feeling like you're an animal on a farm in a pen, but actually being allowed to flow according to your natural desire lines. Once we've improved what we've already got, let's think about intensifying it. Intensification has to address the problem of low density that's been created by planning in the last century. Low density planning has created car dependence. Car dependence has created loneliness, huge mental health problems. We've been able to work with a mental health charity in the UK to understand just how profound this is. And I'd be very interested to hear more from Megan in the discussion afterwards. But by mapping where people have said they feel more or less lonely onto where people are more or less car dependent, we can begin to understand how these things relate. When you're at a time of life where you can't drive, you're living somewhere on your own, you have no social network around you, loneliness is what results. And we have to understand that in building car dependence, we're creating damaging health conditions. So how can we subsidize transport? How can we add public transport? How could we discount a taxi fare to someone in a lonely location to give them the ability to get beyond where they currently are? Because we can't just build in the low density places necessarily. That is a very expensive way of dealing with the problem. But when we do build, if we've got sufficient density, how do we intensify the center of our cities with public transport? So back in Astana, we're putting in public transport, a monorail system, intensifying the use of the street, very broad streets that are windy and empty and cold in the winter and hot in the summer. How do we plant trees, put public transport in, intensify the use of them, using our analytics to identify where the route should go. So finally, in the last couple of minutes, how do we extend a city? How can we use technology to grow a city in a healthy way? Well, first of all, we ask ourselves the question, what are the building blocks of urban planning? In here, you'll see there are no trophy buildings. There are no, yes, it's important to have a key building, an icon, but actually most of the city is about streets. Most of the city is humble. Most of the city is about the spatial network, the plots that people are going to live and work in, the plot typologies in terms of how tall they are, how dense they are, whether they are places to live or work or both. And then lastly, the services. How do we place schools? How do we place public transport, doctors' practices, public spaces? So modeling allows us to do some interesting things. Because we've understood the importance of street connectivity, as I said right at the beginning, to the way that people flow, we've been able to understand that more connected streets create better footfall creates higher property values. You can build a model to describe this. And so in this particular case in Australia, we're extending the city over on the right-hand side. We have calculated 3.7 billion, it's a big number in the little font, 3.7 billion Australian dollars of value being created by this development, by building a new kind of model that measures the intensity of the connectivity and the outcomes that we're going to get. So extending the city into its new places, we've actually used some artificial intelligence to build on all of the research findings that we've made over the decades to try to grow the city using AI. And I just want to show you some of our experimentation to finish. So first of all, we understand at the bottom of this image is our site. We're going to grow the existing city at the top down towards the bottom right. We need to understand where that site is likely to flood first. So that's the blue areas. We might not want to build on those, or we might need to treat them. Secondly, we have a motorway going around the outside of the city. That has a negative impact, an acoustic, the sound of the cars. There's also the red lines are the landing and takeoff acoustic cone from the airport. We need to be aware of where the airport is. That again might influence, or does influence, where we're going to put our buildings. We don't put tall buildings under that cone. We don't necessarily want to put too much residential space under that zone because of the noise that it would create. Then where is the high quality soil that we want to make sure that we don't necessarily build over? Put all of those things together to create a multifaceted parametric model. We can start to identify the prime land and the less prime land. Then we identify the points where the new city can connect and plug into the existing city, because places work, developments work, extensions work according to the quality of the connections they make into the existing place. So we identify those, and then we release the agents in the model, and these are trying to find the simplest, most connected routes from all of those points of entry to the other points of exit onto the motorway, and thinking about where the city might grow beyond. And we let these agents run overnight. We then run an optimizing algorithm on them, which says, how do we turn all of those random paths into a simple network of streets, as you might see in a city? Having established that primary foreground grid of streets, we then say, well, what about the secondary streets? The local places where people might want to live? And we do the same sort of thing. We run an optimizing algorithm to identify those. And then we carry on and say, well, where could the more or less dense places be? More dense in green, less dense in red. And then going right down to the detail of an individual public space, a public block, and saying, according to the kind of investment, the kind of land use, how might the plot sizes vary across all of that? And that ultimately gives us a plan for the commercial parts of the city, the residential parts of the city, the less dense parts of the city, that all connect and integrate to create the proposal in the master plan for Astana that then connects back into the public transport network and gives us a vision of a new place built on those good principles of connected, walkable public space to create that transaction machine that I started with. So I hope that was a helpful contribution, and I look forward to carrying on the discussion after Federico's presentation.
Already been receiving some questions from the floor already. So this is great. Thank you very much, Tim, and we shall, as you said, hear from Federico first, and then we'll have a further discussion. So thank you, Tim. And yes, Federico and I also work together. Federico it runs a company called Mobility in Chain in Milan, and also when I started curating this talk together, realized that Tim also worked with Federico as well on projects. So this Zoom thing is actually getting very interesting about making connections left, right, and center. And in the very first one we did, we had two international speakers from London, and as soon as they got on air, they realized that they were only living 400 yards away from each other. Oh. So that's connectivity for you there. And Federico and I worked together on a project. Funny enough, I don't know whether you remember the first project. Also in Italy, in a place called Alba. Alba is a little place where it's famous for three things. First of all, truffles. Secondly, it's for, I wouldn't mention the name because I'll be making an advert, for a very famous chocolate brand which you'll find everywhere in the world, particularly in this part of the world where you give people as a gift for New Year and so on and so forth. In London, you always remember that, the ambassador's choice, so to speak, that brand. And the other thing is a fashion house, which was our client, which is less famous globally, but no less in Italy. But the interesting thing was that it's very much related to what we were talking about earlier. Is that it's funny because the town Alba, you either work for the chocolate people or you work for the fashion people. There's nothing in between. Very Italian, very much like Romeo and Juliet. The interesting thing was that we were building a factory, headquarters for the fashion company, slightly out of town, for 2,000 people. And actually, we had the requirement was for 1,400 cars for a car park. Oh. So it was a big challenge for Federico and the team. And what comes into is also this kind of what also interests me. That was 15 years ago. I think it might be slightly different now. But the idea is that those people, they only live not that far away, but because it's something that Tim said earlier, it's just the culture, the public transport or wherever, they always have the car and they drive in, but they also drive home for lunch.
Oh, I see.
So that for us, actually driving home for lunch was a much more difficult bit to control because all within an hour, but that actually makes them happy. It is another level of, sort of health, how do you measure their mental health, which is really kind of some home comfort.
Yeah.
It is. I think it's also somewhere along the line need to come into that the way that we build up. But that was 15 years ago. Obviously, we moved on from there. So that was a little bit of introduction for our guest Federico. So Federico is going to talk a little bit about another connection, which is obviously the Shenzhen Biennale, which you were part of, and about the sort of the use of technology and so on. So without further ado, Federico, the mic and the screen is yours.
I do regard Trafalgar Square as, since it's 24 years ago, one of the sort of key projects that really changed or started a family of projects that is happening now, of profound reconfiguration of balance between traffic, cities, people. And in that sense, I think that project is only one large stairs, but I think it proves that you can really change completely the quality of a place with a very small intervention, with virtually no architecture, if you want. In that sense, I think it's a great project. So I'll show you I have let me just share the screen here. Okay, so a very brief introduction about us, because as Roger was just mentioning, we're going to be then dealing with what we presented at the Shenzhen Biennale, but we are basically, we have 3 offices, one in New York, one in Moscow, and one in Milan. We are about 50 people, but we do the vast part of our work is international. And we are also very vertical, so we do transport planning only. So we try to stay sort of close to what we do, which is basically dealing with movement of things at very large scale, regional or much smaller, the scale of a small road, but basically always looking at the way things are moving around space. And I think it was also clear in the presentation with Tim that we've been working, and we learned a lot from Space Syntax and Tim on several projects. We also collaborated in Astana as a transport consultant, and I think that what we do, or we tend to do, is in a way maybe coming from more engineering technical component, also an understanding of the complexity of the relation between the cities and transportation, what it means to basically deal with mobility in cities, and what this implies with the overall quality of the space we inhabit. I think that is our key component. And some of the projects we worked on recently is, for instance, this is a very beautiful project. We worked with MBVA, who's the landscape consultants for this park in Detroit, and we looked at the external connectivity and how you access and how the park can become an element of soft mobility and connection with the surrounding part of the city. Obviously, Detroit, it's a great metaphor of not sticking to one technology and even less sticking to the car. But in that sense, it was a great project. We've been working with OMA for the expansion of the Facebook campus in Menlo Park. And we recently presented with big a project in Tokyo for the expansion of a Toyota area, which is northeast of Tokyo, which was a lot about the technology, innovation, new lifestyles, which is in a way something that we'll see in our work for Shenzhen. And also this project I'm very fond of. I think Moscow is a great city. It's changed dramatically. In my opinion, it's the city that mostly changed in the last 5-6 years. An incredible change, and this is one of the projects we worked on. This is basically the Garden Ring, great road. It's where the Master of Margarita is actually partly located, and the master lived nearby. But basically what I'm trying to say is that we basically looked at the reconfiguration of the road. I'm a big fan of space redistribution and optimization of space by redistributing the road network. You can, very often roads are way bigger than needed, and the traveling speed is way higher than needed, and you can really take smaller roads or larger roads and you can really rearrange it. There is no real golden rule. You can really change, rearrange things at different scales in roads when you come in and you have in mind an idea of creating a better urban space. And we do also work, this is another interchange hub in Moscow, where we try to look at multimedia connectivity, multimodal connectivity, so cars, public transport, pedestrian, agent-based modeling. So we try to describe the complexity. The tools now that are available off the shelf are interesting because they kind of began like working at only cars, and then progressively they integrated all the different modes. And now you can really describe or at least investigate how a city works by looking at all the various components in one single holistic approach. In that sense, even modeling, therefore, is somehow following those new process. And also the automotive, this is a project we've done with Audi, with Style Park, which is, Urban Standard, which is basically their friends from Munich, and we did a lot of studies about the reconfiguration of and the impact of the automotive technologies and how those automotive new technology would have impact in the cities. For instance, in the case of parking and the possibility of stacking much more cars in one single space because of the arrival of autonomous driving and the ability of, therefore, to store cars more in the shape of goods, of logistics, rather than in classical sparking where things have to move independently because they are manually operated. And this is just to give you a very quick insight of our work, and then I will be going into describing the landscape of mobility. And I think I will start from what I feel, but I think I'm sure we all do think, especially in the COVID area, in the COVID time, we think COVID is a big, massive tragedy, but also an element of change that we should try to exploit. And the element of change that we should try to exploit is to be focused against the real issue that I think is the climate change, the climate crisis, or the climate emergency. That is, or should be, the main focus of our thinking and our lifestyles. We should really try to start from that, which is our main task for the near future. And we started off by saying that, there's been a relentless growth of population. I think we all know what happened the last few decades in terms of population, but what is less often mentioned is the fact that it's not just about, let me just maybe it's not just about the growth of population, it's also the growth of cars. There's like a demographic explosion of cars. And what is we were keen of doing the project, I don't know if you see the video, but we were keen of doing the project in China, because this is the Western world, if you want, where the cars are being sold in a kind of stable market. And in red is China. I mean, China is the place where all the big car manufacturers are thinking of making money in the next decades. And you can see it here from the graph. In the West, it will be mostly replacement. In China, it would be a huge new market. And I think, if we want to move away from that, we have to start thinking about the vision that allow us to kind of try to find alternative solutions. And it's easy to understand why, because if you apply the West and even Europe, even if you apply the Danish car share values or the Dutch car share values, if you apply it nationwide, if you don't just look at the nice cozy city center of Copenhagen and Amsterdam, if you look at the car sharing per 1,000 people in the overall city scale, in the nation scale, those are the real numbers. And if you apply that to China or the rest of Asia, it's clearly understood where all those cars will be sold. And it's not just about cars, it's also about the energy that you need to produce it and the energy that you need to run, because as we know, cars are very inefficient system. So we don't say that cars have to disappear, but we have to understand that that's a very large problem ahead of us. So, there is a study from the World Bank that says that in 2050, our vehicle population will double and will reach 2 billions units on the planet, 2 billion. So it's not just demographic of people, it's also demographic of vehicles. And it's actually interesting to point out that one of the most impressive growth in terms of CO2 emissions that has offset the kind of arrival of low emission cars or electrical cars is the fact that a lot of vehicles are now SUVs. And because there are so many vehicles in the planet, the shift from a traditionally compact city car to an SUV has generated a large increase of CO2, as Greg Lindsay mentioned. And therefore, cars are definitely one of the topics we have to tackle. And I think it's interesting. I like this quote because it basically, tells us a story that it's maybe worthwhile kind of telling ourselves again, which is the fact that the largest wave of motorization is yet to come. So what we are seeing around is not what we're going to be seeing in the next 20, 30 years, because we're going to see the double of it. So in that sense, I think it's very important that we start exploring solutions of ideas, of strategies, of how to move out of that. So we started off because of the fact that we were part of the Shenzhen Biennale. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank for that Carlo Ratti, who invited us to this great opportunity, but also the project that was done with Tiziano Cattaneo, who is a professor at Tonji University, and with Carmelo Ignacolo, who is a PhD at the MIT and also an assistant professor at Columbia, but also with the team of people we work with. So with Mirko Franzoi, who led the group, Loris Shakitano, and Gloriana Barbosa. I'd like to thank them all for the effort, which is what we're going to be seeing now. We were focusing on the Pearl River Delta, and what we started off from was, we have to deal with an issue which is coming to megacity. I do believe the cities, in a way, are learning how to get cars out of the way. The redistribution space, the cities are getting mature, and they're learning how to finally, progressively, in large part of the world, changing and progressively reducing the use of cars. What I think is that the issue is what happens when you go outside, when you move away from the sort of high density area to the low density, to the outskirts, because those areas are there. They're not going to disappear. They're not going to be densified, and changing and shifting land use of that scale would be an incredible effort. Even in China, outside the large city center, there's a vast development of suburban environment. So we think that solution has to be tackled just not by saying, okay, it's about land use, because we don't have the time to reshuffle land use on a massive scale. We have to deal with something that becomes a bit more usable in a shorter term. And we started off from looking at the population density. Therefore, this is the Pearl River Delta. This is Hong Kong. I don't know if you can see, if you can see and Shenzhen, if you can see the names. And what we did, we said, okay, you know what? We are taking up, the component which is not high density. You can see we set like a level of density, and you say, okay, below that threshold, all of that doesn't counts. What is above in white, which is high density, actually we remove it. And you see the split of the population. You start sensing that in that red area, there is a very large amount of people, and that red area is also where most of the cars will be sold. Because we know that public transport, the traditional public transport, is not effective in those areas, because the demand of movement is often diffuse, is weak, and distributed. So to find a solution that is very difficult. And for that reason, we also removed the density of transportation. So we said, okay, let's map the transportation densities. We used a system called PTAL, which is kind of density level. And we said, okay, above a certain level, all of that has to be removed. So what you see here is basically in white is the density produced by the mass transit, and the rest is the red. So what we've done in the end, and this is the amount of people that actually have good access versus people that have good access. So what then we combined the two things, and we say, okay, guys, this is the population density, white is the high density. We looked at transportation density, white is the high transportation density. What you see here is basically the extraction. We carved out, we removed the high density and population area, and we looked at the remaining component, which in this square only is about 20 million inhabitants. And that's where the cars will be sold, and that's where the game for our climate change is going to be played. And for that reason, we have to look at those areas. So it's very important that we start imagining something that deals with that. This graph in a way is trying to show there is an inversion of usage between high level of motorization and density, which is kind of working the other way around. And so what we proposed, we proposed to a solution. Obviously, this is a technological solution. We'll go back to the end that changes, systemic changes, do not just rely on technology. We know it very well. Technology can be horribly wrong. Even the most, beautiful technology, like even the car that came along as an element of freedom and modernity, if we can say modernity, is now what we know basically possibly an enemy of our future, and because of the emission related patterns to cars is actually threatening in a way our survival. So how do we do that? The first thing is this is a kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of comment, but we do believe that we have to move away from fixed infrastructures in those environments. The fixed infrastructures are already there, but the fixed infrastructure in general costs a lot of money, emit a lot of CO2 to produce energies. There are now new technologies that allow you to imagine a future that has the same capacity, the same behavioral pattern, but on a completely different framework. So if you have a fixed steel infrastructure, and you can see, you know, the density, the intensity of the energy that is behind the system like that, also the complexity, the mechanical around it. And then if you think about that, okay, you know, but I can actually have the same level of quality in driving with the driverless system. I can have the energy on board, so I don't need expensive infrastructure outside. And I can start imagining that I can split. Those are modular, so they can compose and stay in a large framework and sort of generate a system of like virtual mass transit when the demand is maybe coming higher in certain areas. But then as we move out of that, it can actually become much more distributed and dense. And then on this network, this slow network, I really like the comment, you know, once Tim said, you know, every time we try to, he didn't say it now, but I said for him. It was a sentence by Tim, you know, every time we tried to look for speed, we produced a very bad city and a very bad environment. So the idea is then we can lay on a network, on an isotropic diffused network of roads that are already there with vehicles that move on a slow speed, so below 30 and lower, and instead of going faster, they produce a much more spread out connectivity. So it's not about speed, it's about permeability, it's about connectivity, and it's about the possibility to go from A to B in a different way. So what we did here is, as I was saying, connectivity and not speed. What we were saying here is that we said, okay, what happens if we imagine those systems, this new family of objects, our new driverless framework, but also our small objects that are already coming in a way, the e-bike, the e-mobility, the driverless e-bike and e-mobility, we see it in a minute, you know, this is transition. You know, what if we do this transition, we apply and we push for it? You know, we say, okay, let's go for that. You know, we have two great opportunities. One is on the existing mass transit infrastructure to actually have the very famous last mile connection. And also on the other hand, we can imagine that on the dispersed low density land, those elements will provide an A to B connection. So what we did here, we looked at this. This is a great video done by Carmelo and his team at the MIT using Baidu data sets. It basically shows the vehicles that respond and understands what's around with the digital connectivity and register the event around it. And we sit in the end, we like to think that these vehicles they're going slower, they're also responding to the landscape and what's around a completely different way. Because, you know, if you go in slower, you also engage with the surrounding, with the different opportunities in a completely different way, not only from a digital optimization of the detour of the trips, but also by the ability of you physically seeing what's around you in a different mindset. And so what we did here is a video that is basically showing the different locations. This is a dot of 500 meters. And basically what you see is that, you know, if you start in a dispersed low density area, you know, what happens. So to the left, you have the business as usual, how far you can go in 2 hours. And to the right is by saying, okay, why don't we exploit this slow speed, dense network of roads, both originating from the point of the project, but also allowing to expand the last miles. And you can see immediately that, you know, you can really change completely the face of accessibility without a new massive infrastructure, without zillions of cars, without emissions. The possibility is that if somebody can really push for it is to imagine a massive change. And obviously, this has a lesser effect when you point, this is Shenzhen, when you point the pointer in a very dense area, because a very dense area is already provided with a bulk of mass transit infrastructure, but clearly at the end of the connection, you can see that you can gain a much wider connectivity. So those set of maps are basically showing the different ability to cover areas starting from different points of the Shenzhen area. And here are some of the map. This is from Guangzhou. Sorry about my terrible pronunciation. Before and after with those techniques. I want Tangzhen. It's Roger will be desperate, but again, you see the existing and the possibility of introducing those systems as an enabler to expand the areas well beyond the realm of the current transit connection. So just to finalize, I like to say that those things are basically to the left a new family of objects that are in a way shared, that are allowing to engage with the surrounding, and they also our body is not there enclosed in a bubble, and we like to imagine those micro vehicles which are already on the market and they're coming up. We suggest the possibility. We do not do design vehicles, so it was just a suggestion that we can even imagine starting a possibility of to the left here you see the walking, the cycling, the EV vehicles, the scooters, but also the possibility of those vans to become a system that in a way are taking us completely away from a framed, sealed kind of enclosed bubble. In a car you can be in the desert or in Siberia. It's the same car with the same ability to, and they say, what about if we start, obviously it's a conceptual level, we are part of the landscape. So we are not just optimizing the trips, we are also starting engaging. Are you going slowly around, but you're going slowly, but because of the connectivity, you're going in a very large, you cover a very large part of territory, and then you are become part of the landscape, or you are part of the public space. You are inside and outside, and in a way, the skin could also become something that is actually a skin that has different patterns of responsiveness based upon different times of the day and need. And in a way, as I was saying, those things are already happening. There are new, very interesting startups that are delivering driverless micromobility and electrical micromobility that are already on the market. They do not come from the automotive. They don't have the entire complexity around driverless. And the idea of those objects is that they reposition themselves when there is nobody on board. And when you drive it by yourself, therefore simplifying a lot the situation. So what I'm trying to say is there's a family of things that is happening. It's not just about being cool and going fast, but also being comfortable for the elderly, for the possibility of allowing movement, at least in the Western world, for an aging population. And finally, I like to close the presentation by just saying that obviously all of that, which is the part that is missing to our study, is about the users. Who will be the people of the future? We have to imagine a future that has technologies, but also come along with a socio-cultural changes. There is no innovation. There is no changes. There are no changes without socio-cultural, a new value set. A new value set that has to be a value set in which we put the environment and the issue of sustainability in our value set as relevant as the fact that I have to go from A to B and I have to lead a comfortable life. We have to rearrange our value set. We have to arrange the politics. And I think, maybe when we do the next Biennale, and maybe in Hong Kong, we will like to explore that part of the component. And Megan, I'm sure, can mention that too. How we can use those technology, but how we can transition the users towards a new approach in terms of climate change. Thanks.
So that I answered that question from a kind of organization perspective. I have a couple more questions here, but before we go there, Well, Megan, what do you think? What's your takeaway?
I am in absolute awe of both presentations. And I suppose this is my cheeky way of hopping on the panel so I can get access to this firsthand. But I think both presentations, just like wrapping up some thoughts, both presentations are such wonderful, perfect examples of how, you know, it's not just about technology and being data-driven for the sake of it, but how does that sort of using data in a way that's representative of how our life flow. How do you make that, use data in a way that's representative of how we live, work, and play in our everyday environments? And how do we use the data to really get to that sort of measurement or picture or, you know, dynamic look into that? And what are sort of, how do we inform sort of next steps and changes? And I think Tim mentioned as well that these changes don't have to be massive at all. It's really, and you mentioned earlier, it's more about imagination, the mindset, and the, you know, the social value. So
yes.
How do we all marry that together and to use technology and data in a way that makes sense?
Yes.
So I'm very much in awe by both presentations.
I mean, it's interesting because I one very specific thing, obviously, Tim has been involved with the Biennale since sort of a year or two ago when we started inviting you to be our advisor. He saw the changes in Hong Kong, and it's interesting. He picked up the idea about the barriers.
Right. Yeah.
For me, it's very interesting because obviously the argument for having the barriers is health and safety, but it's also based on data of death rates. Right. Which is kind of after the event kind of data.
Sure.
But the other way to approach it is to measure how safe or how well you feel. Or I wouldn't
like
use the word safe. Perception of the parameters being how easy it is to use, how, you know, and the safety factors also maybe to do with, you know, how, you know, the speed of the vehicle and as well as the speed of the vehicle, the person driving it and so on. And in a way, I always keep thinking when we were looking at all the presentations, all the analysis and data-driven analysis, it almost wants another level of algorithm and matrix on top of it, which is to do with what I always call the function of the soul, how you feel about being in that place, not the physical functions like, you know, distance and light or whatever, but how you feel. And in a way, it will be interesting. You know, obviously we won't be able to do it here, but to start making that connection and the expertise in terms of the healthcare, the health kind of digital health, marrying with digital urbanism. Yeah. And I think that for me is the next step for, you know, and also with what Federico was talking about, you know, how you know, yes, that 2 hours reach, you're beginning to kind of disperse people in a manner. And I'm very interested to see that again, it's not just about the measurable thing about 2 hours, but how you feel when you're in that vehicle, you know, the sort of the softer side of things, and all that, you know, it's for me, it's that integration will be very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I just can't wait for this vehicle to come tomorrow, because I can't wait, because we mentioned earlier on as well, sort of this barrier between sort of the built environment or whatever we encapsulate ourselves with, the four walls, and our natural environment. And just seeing a vehicle like that feels more like an interaction between me as a person, as an individual, and the context I'm in. Yeah,
but I mean, I don't. What do you have anything to add, Tim and Federico?
Well, I would just say I think the point you make about the algorithm of the soul really resonates with me. I think that's a great expression, which I'm gonna borrow.
Algorithm of the soul. It sounds like one of those books where like Hitchhiker's to the Galaxy, you know, kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's your next job, Roger. But you know, I put up an image of a map with red dots on, which was a way of people saying how they felt. And I think if you can take feeling and then map it, I mean, that's my approach to this. That's one way of getting to the feeling. That no transport planner, traffic engineer had done anything like that before. And it came out of an idea from a community meeting I was in with a couple of other community campaigners.
And that tells us a lot, actually, that the expertise is not necessarily only in the heads of the professionally qualified and practiced and experienced individuals, but it's also the expert of the local person who knows their place better than anyone else. So our approach over the years has always been to collect first-hand data of what people actually do, rather than what professional qualified engineer transport planners say they do. And so this point about barriers is one that we addressed by showing how people avoided using the barriers. They took greater risks by, we made a photographic survey of a high street in London, Brixton High Street, that some people on the call may be familiar with. And we found something like 15%, 15% of everyone crossing that street did so by climbing over the barrier. And the health and safety risk of just doing that in the face of fast moving traffic was sufficient to, I think, just make people stop and say, well, are these barriers really doing the job? And then when you take them away, as we did at Trafalgar Square, it was hugely contentious. But the health and safety, the statistics have borne out the fact that the place has become safer because it's being used in a way that feels natural. And so how do you get to that natural, and to the cognitive scientists who study how the brain works and how we make decisions, we have to work with the cognitive scientists as well to understand what's going on in our heads. How do we navigate? And the more that we can feel natural, the more we're less worried about how we're going to get there. And the more we can think and have much higher quality thoughts about maybe a conversation with someone. Maybe an idea might spark. Maybe we just feel better. And that's why I think all of this needs to be really closely looked at in a community level and also a scientific level.
Is it possible to measure the soul? I mean, is it possible to have data about how you feel?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one way, which is traditional questionnaires, which is you just jot down, how your self-perceptions. But increasingly, there are other ways through your smartphone as well to basically understand your mental health and wellness. So actually looking at Tim's presentation, there's also been some studies as well looking at GPS data and people's sentiments in different locations as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is possible to have an algorithm of the soul. Yeah. It's not impossible.
Some material for your book.
Very well. I'm not a book writer, but I'm. Well, anyway, that's a very good term.
You are now.
Yeah, thank you. So,
maybe I can add the one thing.
Yeah,
as well,
Federico.
To also what Megan was mentioning, and I think that if at least this applies for Europe, I guess it applies also from the UK, although it's not Europe anymore. But the issue is that there is an aging population, and we've been getting older and older, and our life expectancies has increased largely, and basically, we our time that we dedicate to work is basically staying stable. And I've also noticed that there are some studies that says that also our sleeping patterns have not have expanded, but rather we tend to sleep less. So our life are becoming busy over lots of other things that are not just work. And we definitely have a problem of health, obesity, but in general lifestyle. And I think it's very clear, and look at the younger generation now, that this issue of the lifestyle, of the quality of your life and the sports and the engagement with the outside is becoming so more important than one of the baby boomers that were stuck in their cars, isolated from the environment and completely sealed to the outside. And I think that what we're trying to say with the vehicles in a kind of tongue-in-cheek, but in general, is that transportation and mobility will also be or will grow progressively away from being on an isolated vessel, on a probe that is thrown in the sort of landscape that stays in the background, but you will be more and more engaged with your body. I mean, it's obvious if you walk, it's obvious if you bike, it's less obvious if you're on a mechanized vehicles. But I think the issue is that we have to start kind of telling a story of this engagement with the outside. We have to get out metaphorically from a bubble of privacy, of being secluded, and sort of engaging with the outside. And I do believe that also because of the fact that we have more time and we engage with the outside, mobility, the experience, and this is again about staying outside, quality of life, healthiness will become so important. The new generation of long walking distance and cyclists will become more and more present in our cities, and walking inside the long distance range, as a friend of mine based in London says, will become more and more relevant. So the project was about engaging and telling the story of the body, the outside, the inside, and you know that we are all part of Gaia, if you want to, single continuous element, and that you know we have to start moving away from a bubble, something secluded, closed. When we were working with Audi, I was amazed because we went to see their test areas, and what you do, you know, if you have an Audi, but it applies to each, you know, there's a mega fridge and a mega oven, and you know, there's also the wind tunnel, and that thing, you are going inside, and you always have to be, you know, exactly in the same microenvironment. And it's basically a car is a probe sent to the different climates. So in that sense, you know, it was maybe a tongue-in-cheek little vehicle, but the idea of sort of kind of blending to the outside and making something in which your body is engaged to the outside, although you are on a mechanized vehicle, is part of the narrative. So I was mentioning that too because Megan brought it to the picture, to the table.
It actually leads into our questions quite well, because I'll read out the first question, which was actually addressed to you, Federico. Is that it's very similar to what I was thinking. In fact, I'll just read it out word by word. Your proposal is very reasonable and logical, and in line with the technology that is already available. So it's not rocket science. It's not reinventing kind of the world, as it were. But how do we convince people and government to change our lifestyle? That is the crux to saving our environment.
This is a question which is much bigger than just cars, and I think there is an issue that you know, we also in Convenient Truth, Al Gore, that was like 15 years ago, and he was supposed to say, you know, we're all the big globe, and we're gonna change the planet all together. But the truth is that none of that has happened, and we are as Bruno Latour says, more divided than more unified, and we're going in the opposite direction. So the question is more than how do we convince the government to have those vehicles in, is how do we find a way to bring the ecological and climate catastrophe that we are heading towards into the political discussion, and how do we bring this catastrophe into our new lifestyles. And I think that is the main topic. Without a change in value set and a change in propositions, is going to be very difficult. But as you can say, all the technologies and all the possibilities are already there. And I think that China, for instance, is now leading the way towards electrical mobility, is pushed immensely. And because the market of the cars is here, is basically, you know, the big German manufacturers are going electric big time. If they want to sell in China in the next 10 years, they have to go electric. So I think that we have to go into that narrative, and we have to make ourselves, through our lifestyle and through our ability to pressurize the political realm, that this can happen. Because as I was saying, the technology is already there. But you know, it's not just that we cannot do these kind of solutions. It's also, you know, how come that we, you know, there is so many SUVs. You know, SUVs, I'm cut a very strong. SUVs make much more money for a car manufacturer. So if you sell an SUV, you make more money than if you sell a small compactor, but because the value is higher and your margin profit goes higher. So all the car manufacturers have changed their production. You know, we have our old Fiat that used to make our small city cars, now merged with Chrysler, and they are selling a lot of Jeeps in Italy. But there's no need for Jeeps in Italy. It's just larger, more emitting pollutant cars. The reason why they want to sell that and not the old Fiat 500 is because they make more money. So I think in that sense, we really have to find a very strong vision for our future, and we have to find the ability to convey that in the political decision, because obviously this is a political decision. So I guess what I can say is that from our end, we have to adapt and change our lifestyles. And then I think we have to pressurize people that takes decision into changing, of which our solution is one, but obviously on a much wider set of.
Yeah, I think the crux of it is as you said, is much wider, but the crux of it is really how you change the value system within different cultures. I mean that in a way is a biggest challenge on a lot of them. Tim has something to say, I think. Tim?
Thanks, Roger. Just wanted to add to this discussion. I think we may have all the technology, but we don't yet have all of the evidence. And this is a bit like smoking. You know, smoking in many parts of the world is considered unpleasant, antisocial, unhealthy, and hugely damaging in terms of the costs on the healthcare industry providers. That has led to a complete transformation of the social culture of the United States, of Western Europe, and it happened very, very slowly, but eventually it happened. As people understood the massive cost of this. And so cigarette manufacturers have had to repurpose themselves, and they've gone to other parts of the world and so on. And we've seen that happening. But I think when we really truly understand the massive cost of transport, fast divisive transport, these SUVs, these cars, then we'll understand this is clearly it's a climate emergency problem, but it's also a health problem. And put those costs together in an equation, that's when national governments might then start to understand that there's better ways of spending money.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe, can I just add a last story, yes, then I'll let you, just because the conversation is going. I want to say that, you know, there is some examples. For instance, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo is actually an interesting case of politically willingness to change, to bring the ecological agenda back in and to change the city. I also found that the barriers that Tim was showing in Hong Kong kind of sad to see, because those are devices to prevent people from walking, and the truth is that there are sometimes the possibility of changing city if you go deep into you know, there are sometimes you know, also the mayor of Moscow, I think, made an incredible work in changing the city. Sometimes there is, if you know, if you find the right people, if you can get the right political vision, especially at city level, you can really change cities in an incredible fast pace.
Thank you, Federico. I have two questions which are very much related, and I think probably all three of you will have something to say about it. So the first question is, how can private companies and institutions take advantage of the ever-growing amount of data on mental health, on mobility, and livability? And then the second question, which is very much related, is, do you have examples of cities and companies taking advantage of design for mental health? So anybody wants to go first? Tim, you're nodding.
Yeah, thanks. I think we need to integrate our professions. If the health professionals worked alongside the built environment professionals, that would be a real start, and it just doesn't happen enough. We're separate worlds with separate names for the same thing, and we need to come together far more often. So, we should all, Federico and I should be working with Megan and her colleagues as well on all of these projects. They shouldn't be done by separate departments. It's a problem of governance. We need to understand that the built environment is the lowest common denominator of all of the departments that serve it, and therefore all of those departments need to work together. In the UK, I did some work a long time ago now, 12 years at least, on the relationship between health and the built environment that found very clear evidence that slower, better connected places were healthier places in which people took more physical activity. The evidence just needs, it was good evidence, but it wasn't sufficient. So we've got to keep doing these studies. We've got to keep demonstrating it, because there are cities that are doing good. Federico mentioned Paris. It's phenomenal what's happening in Paris. You just have to see video of the boulevards of cycling that have replaced the boulevards of driving at speed, and it's amazing. And London has made great strides with cycle superhighways, but also with walking improvements. And in the UK generally, we have managed to fund walking and cycling improvements in the last 2 months that the money just wasn't there for previously. So I'm very optimistic. I think we're seeing, like I said, it's a silver lining. COVID is the accelerator of the effort needed to address the climate emergency. COVID has come along and it's given us a kick in the backside to do what we should have been doing anyway. And I think my other panelists may have other examples, but there are lots of good news stories out there. The tactical urbanism in New York, look at what street plans are doing, what Mike Lydon is doing. Look at what speakers in the Academy of Urbanism in the UK are talking about. Every Friday morning, Friday lunchtime UK time, they have an event like this to talk about all of this change happening now. There's so much of it, the waiting list is long. So there's plenty to learn from.
Thank you. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Hong Kong is quite behind in that sense. So the study I talked about using, mapping, quite literally spatially mapping suicide and dense urban areas, that was done in 2015, and that was considered like quite cutting edge. So we personally here, at least, we haven't seen it at that level. At that level of institutional sort of change and implementation. I agree with Tim that COVID has just been this catalyst for addressing things like climate change and mental health at an unprecedented rate, because we have to. But at least what I've seen is not at a governmental level, but even just things like more bottom up, just, even just companies, for example, leveraging these kinds of, or at least being welcoming of using, digital data to support analog processes, like bettering social connections, or allowing people to use data to take care of their mental health and wellness, or, real estate developers who are trying to better build buildings that promote and help people sustain their health and mental health and wellness. One good example is the WELL certification, having mind health as an actual segment.
Yes.
So I guess we're coming at it from more of a bottom up method, as opposed to like a top down change, if you will.
But thank you, Federico.
Maybe I can add a couple of things. One thing is that at least this coming a bit from the Western world, especially from the States, on digital data. I think we talk about a lot of digital data, but I think there is a massive issue of ownership. And what I can say, also by looking at the e-bike that been destroyed by Uber recently, that in general, I think that when it comes to data sets, we have to be very careful, because I don't think that keeping large corporates to run the data set is the solution.
Not at all.
Exactly. So I think it's very important that we stay with a public environment, because I think that's where most of the focus for the wealth of the citizen is. And I think in that sense, it's an important component. In general, I think that also, COVID was a great game changer. I can say it from Milan, where Milan is flat, relatively small city, and finally, thanks also to a young couple of enthusiastic guys in the council, there's been this push for bicycle connectivity, and therefore I think that COVID, in a way, when we're going back to what can we do to make this thing happen, what is sad is that it took a tragedy to actually engage the cities, the citizen, and everybody into this shift of mindset in producing a change. And then when Tim was mentioning about working with Mega, I totally agree with that. In general, I think everybody has now understood that the reality, the project, the way live, it's all an engaged, you cannot really have silos of knowledge. You cannot have, okay, there's the health guy, and then there is the traffic engineer, and there's the planner, and everybody does his own little silos. You have to bring everything together. It's all intertwined, interconnected, and that complexity has to be within the planning process, within the thinking of the cities. It has to be integrated together, because we are dealing with a very complex and integrated reality that we have to try to improve.
Thank you, Federico. I'll just read out a few more. Some of them are actually comments, and some I think we've probably answered already. For example, it says well, it is a praise for the speakers. Great talk, so on and so forth. Are your research used for transport infrastructure planning? I think what you've shown, your slides have shown to have been used for transport infrastructure planning on local level, on neighborhood level, or up to regional level. So I think that's probably pretty much a big yes to that question. And the other is a comment about the University of Hong Kong's Professor Chris Webb. I think Tim, you will know him. He was always from the UK, yeah, from Welsh School of Architecture and all that. Researches on walkability and health relationship, and your use of John Snow thinking can really have implications to Hong Kong, and I think that's a good connection to make as well. I mean, health and walkability and so on and so forth. So those are two really comments, and there's one specific question for Tim, which I'll add a bit onto, is that do you see your AI? I think he meant the agents that you release in your program can inform growing the city where there is only water. So I think probably going back to basics, so to speak, and then can it also indicate where a chosen site is not logical to build on?
Yeah, maybe I could respond to a few of those. The first question: do we use our research to do transport and infrastructure planning projects? We actually do it the other way around. We're a practice that uses our transport and infrastructure projects, our master planning work, to do research and to advance knowledge through projects. It's a slight twist on things. I'm not based in a university. I'm a practitioner, so we do master planning, but we make sure that we do research all the while, and we connect into research networks who can then do more fundamental work. In terms of the question about AI, yes, absolutely. Sometimes the computer says no, that this site is not the right place. And in fact, we were working on a growth project for a town where they identified one site that they wanted to place a major cultural attraction on, and another site that they wanted to place a shopping development on. And we said, actually, both of those sites don't work for their intended purpose. You want to, in fact, swap them. And they did a £1 land deal to swap them, because there was a much better retail connectivity by swapping the sites and a much better cultural connectivity. Likewise, equally, projects where we've just said, no, you should not grow in that direction at all because of land contamination or land quality or nature sensitivity, or you've got a city which is already so loose and fragmented that you should fix it before you build more of the city. Don't just displace the problem, fix the problem.
Very good, thank you. Another question for Federico. How close are we to various alternative mobility projects being implemented? Are there cities implementing this?
You mentioned autonomous, or?
How close are we to various alternative mobility projects being implemented?
So the first thing I'd like to say is that I find what I can say, as I am now, I'm a man of a certain age. When I started, the issue of sustainable mobility and the discussions around the walkability and health environments were completely alien, at least to a large part of the world. Now you sit down in meetings in California or in Saudi Arabia, even, and completely car-dominated culture, but the problem of obesity and diabetes. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the truth is that I sense that there's been a massive change in the value set and a general consensus around those things. What makes the difference is the implementation. I think the difference between talking and acting, and I think that is where is the interesting part now. At least as a consultant now, I find more interesting the approval and transformation process than the project itself. And I think as professionals, we should be starting designing those processes, meaning, the complexity of making things happening. And I think that there are some examples around the world. I think, I don't want to mention always the same places, but I can definitely say that as we said earlier on, Paris, but even Milan, and a long time ago, they started in Copenhagen and Amsterdam. Things have been changing big time. So I think those innovative mobility projects are happening, and the autonomous driving is also happening. There are several cities in Switzerland that are testing beds now, and the advantage of autonomous driving is that you reduce greatly the running costs, because electrical and autonomous means less maintenance and less people on board, which is in the Western world the reason why those systems cannot be produced, because they cost simply too much money. The idea of going autonomous is not because we fancy the technology, but it's because it allows you to have a financial feasibility to make it happen. Because as Jared Walker says, it's virtually impossible to have a 6-8 seaters on-demand system that works if there is somebody that has to operate it. So in that sense, either you do it where the labor cost is incredibly cheap, but in organized environments, it becomes very difficult. So I think there are a new value set that is already coming in some cities, a completely new, different mindset that brings sustainability, space distribution, a new way of thinking. And there are also the test beds of new technologies, and it would be interesting to see who brings them together on a very sort of bold sort of vision.
Tim, I think you have something to say.
Yeah, just I can't help but come in on this conversation about, I'll call it experience, not age, Federico. Having a certain amount of experience, I think it's worth noting things take time. Things do take time. Getting people to understand the safety benefits of not smoking, I mentioned that earlier. But the fact that this change does happen. So I think for a lot of people with less experience and lots of ambition, it can always seem frustrating. And one thing I try to say to all of my colleagues when they join is, you've got to understand a couple of things. Most of what we're going to work on together will never happen. The second thing is, if it does happen, it's going to take a long time to happen. And if you can accept those two things, then you can practice. And I think that's just the nature of urbanism. Of course, we want things to happen sooner, and we want everything that we do to happen because we think it's right. But actually, it's like using practice for research. You have to allow for some of the things that you do to not be the right thing and therefore to not happen. And so, for example, I was working on a mobility project probably 20 years ago with the idea of a scooter, an autonomous scooter that would take you from where you lived to the town centre. And that while you shopped in the town centre, it would follow you around and it would carry your bag. And that when you went for lunch, it would drive back home and take the goods back home so that they'd be ready for you when you actually were ready to go home. It would come back and pick you up. Now, all of this sort of thinking was happening before we had Google Maps, before we had real idea that we had technologies for autonomous driving. So we didn't have scanning and mapping, and we didn't have 5G digital connectivity or low Earth orbit satellites. But it was the kind of visionary thinking that planted seeds. And so if people are watching frustrated about things not happening fast enough, it's always a seed that gets planted that sometimes needs time to grow. Thank
you, Tim. I think if we carry on, we can carry on forever, but there will be no audience, just the four of us talking. So the very well, which is fine because I think it's recorded and people can enjoy it later. Final question for all four of us, because I think I can answer it, and I want you to answer it in very quickly, because this question, I think, in itself is another session. Is there cultural differences between regions for the urban design innovation? And my answer to that is a big yes. So over to you.
I think we could start with our
Start with Tim. Yeah. Is there cultural differences between regions for the urban design innovation?
Me first.
Yep.
I'm going to say a big no. In order to put a different viewpoint across. And let me try and explain. I think there are so many similarities between cultures that sometimes we don't recognize them. Of course, there are differences. You only have to take the act of eating to understand that you can go from one part of a city to the other and the behaviors can be slightly different. Which hand do you use? Do I eat everything at the same time? Or what we do at the dining table distinguishes us. And sometimes we do it deliberately in order to make the point that we're different. Get out of the dining room and get onto the high street all over the world, whether it's Wan Chai, whether it's Wang Fujing, whether it's Melbourne, Moscow, Tokyo, London, Milan, Paris, New York. Buildings come down and at the bottom of them, there is a shop that faces out onto the street, that when the weather is good, opens its doors, and there are tables and chairs and people sit at it. That is the cultural similarity of good, healthy urban design, which we need much, much more of. We, of course, have to accept our cultural differences, our language differences, our cultural histories. They make us who we are. But what makes us possible to talk to each other and engage across those cultural boundaries are the urban design similarities that come out at the bottom of buildings. I'll leave it there because I know that time is short, but we're much more similar than we think. I'd love to.
The speakers out with us. Yes.
I'd love to.
Maybe I can add. I totally agree with that. I think there was a moment in which the idea of a city was hijacked by a sort of northern car-based approach that has generated so many. It was an idea behind the freedom, and I don't say it wasn't. It was a bad idea. It was about the freedom and the ability to access everything. But the truth is that at the end, the result has proven to be wrong. And even in places where the car presence is so incredibly dominant, there is now a clear consciousness that this is not the right model. So, as Tim was saying, I totally agree with the fact that. The idea of intimacy of space, of base of building being active, the quality of a public space is very much across culture. And I reinstate the fact that what I think is interesting now is to look at the ones that are saying that and then they deploy measures to make it happen. and people that are saying that and then they don't find the political ability to deploy measures. I think that's where is the tricky part for the next 10, 15 years. The one that says and act, and the one that says and do not act.
Thank you. And final word from you?
You had a resounding...
I had a resounding yes. And,
resounding yes.
Yes. That was my short answer. No, because I think from my perspective, I think in a way I'm in agreement with Tim in that there are fundamentals, there are in principles, there are a lot of similarities. So almost like universal truth on the very high level, it is in the detail level that the how we eat and so on and so forth, that manifests itself. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter how we design different cities and so on, because we all work internationally, we need to treasure those that makes us different, as well as respect the, sort of make use of the universal truth, which governs, certain kind of aspect in principle. I suppose it's sort of looking at different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I come at it from this is not my expertise, but from more like a mental health perspective. I suppose I fall in the same camp as Tim in that we do have sort of these shared more universal needs, like social connection, for example. So things like eating outside together in like communal spaces, like these things. But an area which I'm not sure, and I'd love to head back or, find all of you later on and discuss this further, is sort of what's the directionality of that effect? Is it our built environment sort of creating that difference, or is it something inherent in? So.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, it's a chicken and egg catch-22 situation where whether we're defined by our environment or how, if it is, how do we break it out in terms of start defining the environment because of our differences. So that's great. It's been a fantastic session. I enjoyed it very much, just like I've enjoyed the previous sessions. So thank you very much for Federico. Thank you very much for Tim, and thank you very much for Megan. Now, I am super excited about our next session, which is next Thursday. Not only because I am not the host, actually, because I can't be the host, because the next session, Curatorial Conversation number 11, I think, is on diversity, equality, and inclusivity. And for that, we've actually had an all-female cast of international speakers, moderator, i.e. not me, and panelists. So I'm very much looking forward to it. And if you are, stay tuned, further information further will be released, and it will be as, again, it will be as diverse as this session. It's not just talking about one industry or one aspect of equality and so on. So I hope we'll see all the everybody again soon. And again, we will share the information in the next couple of days to anybody who's registered, and please help us share the information to people who think should also have listened to this session. Thank you, and good night to all, and good afternoon to people from Europe. Thank you.